With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the investigation into the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal and the subsequent poisoning of Dawn Sturgis and Charlie Rowley earlier this year. This was a sickening and despicable act in which a devastatingly toxic nerve agent known as Novichok was used to attack our country. It left 4 people fighting for their lives and 1 innocent woman dead. And I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with the family of Dawn Sturgis in particular, following their tragic loss. In March, I set out for the House why the government concluded that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. I also said that while we all share a sense of impatience to bring those responsible to justice, as a nation that believes in the rule of law, we would give the police the space and time to carry out their investigation properly. Since then, around 250 detectives have trawled through more than 11,000 hours of CCTV and taken more than 1,400 statements. Working around the clock, they have carried out painstaking and methodical work to ascertain exactly which individuals were responsible and the methods they used to carry out this attack. Mr. Speaker, this forensic investigation has now produced sufficient evidence for the Independent Director of Public Prosecutions to bring charges against 2 Russian nationals for the conspiracy to murder Sergei Skripal, the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, the use and possession of Novichok, and causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey. This morning, the police have set out how the 2 Russian nationals travelled under the names of Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bushirov, names the police believe to be aliases. They arrived at Gatwick Airport at 3 p.m. on Friday, the 2nd of March, having flown from Moscow on flight SU 2588. They travelled by train to London Victoria, then on to Waterloo, before going to the City Stay Hotel in Bow Road, East London. They stayed there on both Friday and Saturday evenings, and traces of Novichok were found in their hotel room. On Saturday, the 3rd of March, they visited Salisbury, arriving at approximately 2:25 p.m. and leaving less than 2 hours later at 4:10 p.m. The police are confident this was for reconnaissance of the Salisbury area. On Sunday, the 4th of March, they made the same journey, travelling by underground from Bow to Waterloo Station at approximately 8:05 a.m, before continuing by train to Salisbury. The police have today released CCTV footage of the 2 men, which clearly places them in the immediate vicinity of the Skripals' house at 11:58 a.m, which the police say was moments before the attack. They left Salisbury and returned to Waterloo, arriving at approximately 4:45 p.m, and boarded the Underground at approximately 6:30 p.m. to Heathrow, from where they returned to Moscow on flight SU 2585, departing at 10:30 p.m. Mr. Speaker, this hard evidence has enabled the Independent Crown Prosecution Service to conclude they have a sufficient basis on which to bring charges against these 2 men for the attack in Salisbury. The same 2 men are now also the prime suspects in the case of Dawn Sturgis and Charlie Rowley too. There is no other line of inquiry beyond this. And the police today have formally linked the attack on the Skripals and the events in Amesbury, such that it now forms one investigation. There are good reasons for doing so. Our own analysis, together with yesterday's report from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, has confirmed that the exact same chemical nerve agent was used in both cases. There is no evidence to suggest that Dawn and Charlie may have been deliberately targeted, but rather were victims of the reckless disposal of this agent. The police have today released further details of the small glass counterfeit perfume bottle and box discovered in Charlie Rowley's house, which was found to contain this nerve agent. And the manner in which the bottle was modified leaves no doubt it was a cover for smuggling the weapon into the country and for the delivery method for the attack against the Skripals' front door. Mr. Speaker, the police investigation into the poisoning of Dawn and Charlie is ongoing, and the police are today appealing for further information. But were these two suspects within our jurisdiction, there would be a clear basis in law for their arrest for murder. Mr. Speaker, we repeatedly asked Russia to account for what happened in Salisbury in March, and they have replied with obfuscation and lies. This is including trying to pass the blame for the attack onto terrorists, onto our international partners, and even onto the future mother-in-law of Yulia Skripal. They even claimed that I myself invented Novichok. Their attempts to hide the truth by pushing out a deluge of disinformation simply reinforces their culpability. As we made clear in March, only Russia had the technical means, operational experience and motive to carry out the attack. Novichok nerve agents were developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s under a programme codenamed Foliant. Within the past decade, Russia has produced and stockpiled small quantities of these agents, long after it signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. And during the 2000s, Russia commenced a programme to test means of delivering nerve agents, including by application to door handles. We were right to say in March that the Russian state was responsible. And now we have identified the individuals involved, we can go even further. Mr. Speaker, just as the police investigation has enabled the CPS to bring charges against the two suspects, so the security and intelligence agencies have carried out their own investigations into the organisation behind this attack. Based on this work, I can today tell the House that, based on a body of intelligence, the government has concluded that the two individuals named by the police and CPS are officers from the Russian Military Intelligence Service, also known as the GRU. The GRU is a highly disciplined organisation with a well-established chain of command. So this was not a rogue operation. It was almost certainly also approved outside the GRU at a senior level of the Russian state. Mr. Speaker, the House will appreciate that I cannot go into details about the work of our security and intelligence agencies, but we will be briefing opposition leaders and others on Privy Council terms, and also giving further detail to the Intelligence and Security Committee. Let me turn to our response to this appalling attack and the further knowledge we now have about those responsible. First, with respect to the two individuals, as the Crown Prosecution Service and Police announced earlier today, we have obtained a European arrest warrant and will shortly issue an Interpol red notice. Of course, Russia has repeatedly refused to allow its nationals to stand trial overseas, citing a bar on extradition in its constitution. So, as we found following the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, any formal extradition request in this case would be futile. But should either of these individuals ever again travel outside Russia, we will take every possible step to detain them, to extradite them, and to bring them to face justice here in the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, this chemical weapons attack on our soil was part of a wider pattern of Russian behaviour that persistently seeks to undermine our security and that of our allies around the world. They fomented conflict in the Donbass, illegally annexed Crimea, repeatedly violated the national airspace of several European countries, and mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and election interference. They were behind a violent attempted coup in Montenegro and a Russian-made missile launched from territory held by Russian-backed separatists brought down MH17. We must step up our collective effort to protect ourselves in response to this threat, and that is exactly what we have done since the attack in March, both domestically and collectively with our allies. We've introduced a new power to detain people at the UK border to determine whether they are engaged in hostile state activity. We've introduced the Magnitsky Amendment to the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act in response to the violation of human rights. And we have radically stepped up our activity against illicit finance entering our country. We also expelled 23 Russian diplomats who had been identified as undeclared Russian intelligence officers, fundamentally degrading Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come. And in collective solidarity and in recognition of the shared threat posed to our allies, 28 other countries, as well as NATO, joined us in expelling a total of over 150 Russian intelligence officers, the largest collective expulsion ever. Since then, the EU agreed a comprehensive package to tackle hybrid threats. The G7 agreed a rapid response mechanism to share intelligence on hostile state activity. NATO has substantially strengthened its collective deterrence, including through a new cyber operations centre. And the US has announced additional sanctions against Russia for the Salisbury attack. Mr. Speaker, our allies acted in good faith, and the painstaking work of our police and intelligence agencies over the last 6 months further reinforces that they were right to do so. Together, we will continue to show that those who attempt to undermine the international rules-based system cannot act with impunity. We will continue to press for all of the measures agreed so far to be fully implemented, including the creation of a new EU chemical weapons sanction regime. But we will not stop there. We will also push for new EU sanctions regimes against those responsible for cyber attacks and gross human rights violations, and for new listings under the existing regime against Russia. And we will work with our partners to empower the OPCW to attribute chemical weapons attacks to other states beyond Syria. Most significantly, Mr. Speaker, what we have learnt from today's announcement is the specific nature of the threat from the Russian GRU. We know that the GRU has played a key part in malign Russian activity in recent years. And today we have exposed their role behind the despicable chemical weapons attack on the streets of Salisbury. The actions of the GRU are a threat to all our allies and to all our citizens. And on the basis of what we have learnt in the Salisbury investigation and what we know about this organisation more broadly, we must now step up our collective efforts specifically against the GRU. We're increasing our understanding of what the GRU is doing in our countries, shining a light on their activities, exposing their methods and sharing them with our allies, just as we have done with Salisbury. And, Mr. Speaker, while the House will appreciate that I cannot go into details, together with our allies, we will deploy the full range of tools from across our national security apparatus in order to counter the threat posed by the GRU. I have said before, and I say again now, that the UK has no quarrel with the Russian people. And we continue to hold out hope that we will one day, once again, enjoy a strong partnership with the government of this great nation. As a fellow permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, we will continue to engage Russia on topics of international peace and security. But we will also use these channels of communication to make clear there can be no place in any civilised international order for the kind of barbaric activity which we saw in Salisbury in March. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me pay tribute to the fortitude of the people of Salisbury, Amesbury and the surrounding areas who have faced such disruption to their daily lives over the past 6 months. Let me once again thank the outstanding efforts of the emergency services and National Health Service in responding to these incidents. And let me thank all those involved in the police and intelligence community for their tireless and painstaking work, which has led to today's announcement. Mr. Speaker, back in March, Russia sought to sow doubt and uncertainty about the evidence we presented to this House, and some were minded to believe them. Today's announcement shows that we were right. We were right to act against the Russian state in the way we did, and we are right now to step up our efforts against the GRU. We will not tolerate such barbaric attacks against our country. And together with our allies, this government will continue to do whatever is necessary to keep our people safe. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement and for the security briefings that we've received. Our thoughts are today with the family of Dawn Sturgis and with Charlie Rowley, who's still recovering from his ordeal. And we're obviously very sad at the death of Dawn and send condolences to her partner and her family. And we send our best wishes too to Sergei and Yulia Skripal for a very full recovery. The use of military nerve agents on the streets of Britain is an outrage and beyond reckless. 6 months after the attack, Salisbury and its people are still suffering the after effects of this attack. I found that when I visited the city earlier this summer. There was an eerie calm hanging over the city, and on a summer's evening, a large park cordoned off for security purposes so the police can continue their investigations created a very strange and very eerie atmosphere. And I think we should show some sympathy for the people of Salisbury and what they've gone through, and I know the Prime Minister has done that in her statement. I commend the police for their superhuman efforts in forensically trawling through hours and hours of information in helping to identify the suspects. Given today's announcement on the decision to charge 2 Russian citizens with responsibility for this appalling attack, what steps is the Prime Minister taking to secure cooperation from the Russian government in bringing them to trial? The OPCW's... This is a serious matter, Mr. Speaker, and I think they should be brought to trial. The OPCW's findings... OPCW's findings of the evidence that Novichok was used in Salisbury are a stark reminder that the international community must strengthen its resolve to take effective action against the possession, spread or use of chemical weapons in any circumstances. No government anywhere can or should put itself above the international law. The Prime Minister previously outlined that the type of nerve agent used was identified as being manufactured in Russia. The use of this nerve agent is a clear violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and therefore a breach of international law. Mr. Speaker, based on the OPCW findings, the Russian government must give a full account of how this nerve agent came to be used in the UK. Will the Prime Minister continue to pursue a formal request for evidence from the Russian government under Article 9(2)? It is in the interest of the peace and security of all people and all countries that no government plays fast and loose with the international human rights rules-based system. Can the Prime Minister update the House on what contacts, if any, she's had with the Russian government more recently to hold it to account? Our response as a country must be guided by the rule of law, support for international agreements and respect for human rights, even and perhaps especially when other countries don't respect those agreements. I'll say more on that in one moment. But I want to assure the Prime Minister and the House that we will back any further reasonable and effective actions, whether against Russia as a state or the GRU as an organisation. And I would encourage the Prime Minister to seek the widest possible European and international consensus for this to maximise its impact. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the United Nations set up the Organisation for Prevention of Chemical Weapons, a UN joint investigative mechanism, but due to no agreement in the UN Security Council, there is no international mechanism responsible for attributing chemical weapons attacks to any specific perpetrators. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister outline what efforts the UK has made at the UN Security Council to overcome this impasse so that the OPCW will be allowed to provide clarity and attribution to the violators of international chemical weapons law? While we all hope that our country will never suffer such attacks again, can the Prime Minister outline what lessons have been learned by police and health service staff and what training has been given to both police and health service staff in dealing with a nerve agent attack? This is no way a criticism, indeed it's a congratulations to them on the way that they performed after the attack in Salisbury. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we utterly condemn the appalling attacks. We condemn the police and security service. Commend the police and security. We commend the police and security services for their diligence in investigating this appalling crime, and we will support any reasonable action to bring those responsible to justice and to take further action against Russia for its failure to cooperate with this investigation.
Prime Minister.
Can I first of all say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, as I said in my statement, that I'm sure all members of this House join both of us in saying to the people of Salisbury, they have been through, and the Amesbury and the surrounding area, they have been through terrible disruption in the recent months, and we commend the dignity and calm way in which they have approached this and in which they have dealt with this. The right honourable gentleman asked me what we had done in relation to approaching the Russian government on the question of bringing these two individuals to justice. As I said in my statement, we're issuing an Interpol Red Notice, we've issued a European arrest warrant, but as we saw in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, Russia does not allow its citizens to be extradited to face justice in other countries. And therefore, as I think the phrase I used in my statement was that an attempted extradition extradition request would be futile. What we have done is repeatedly asked Russia to account for what happened in Salisbury in March, and what they have done is responded with obfuscation and lies. We want Russia to act as a responsible member of the international community. That means that it must account for the reckless and outrageous actions of the GRU, which is part of the Russian state. This is a decision that would have been taken at a level outside the GRU and at a high level in the Russian state. They must rein in the activities of the GRU, and they must recognise there can be no place in any civilised international order for the kind of barbaric activity which we saw in Salisbury in March. The right honourable gentleman asks me about the OPCW and the United Nations Security Council. We have been working through the OPCW, and I'm pleased to say that we had an overwhelming vote on a proposal that we and others had put forward earlier in the summer in relation to strengthening the OPCW's ability to attribute to those who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons. There are further discussions to take place within the OPCW on that issue, but I hope that the whole international community, and I would hope some of those who previously were cautious about accepting what we had said in March about the responsibility for this, will now see the clear responsibility that lies at the doors of Russia and will act accordingly. And on the United Nations Security Council, it is right that the United Nations Security Council has not been able to come together to agree an arrangement for attribution on the use of chemical weapons. Why has that been? Russia vetoes any attempt to do that. So we will work through the OPCW. We will continue to give the very clear message that states cannot and people cannot use chemical weapons with impunity. We will maintain and do all we can to reinforce the international rules-based order in relation to the use of chemical weapons. And I and this government, and I'm sure other members of this House, will be very clear about the culpability of the Russian state in the attack on Salisbury.
Mr. Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for her statement. I think the whole House will have noted what I'm afraid was the somewhat weaselly language of the Leader of the Opposition in failing to condemn what is now, I think, incontrovertible in the eyes of all right-thinking people, the involvement of the Russian state at the highest level in the Salisbury poisonings. And will my right honourable friend confirm that we will be asking that these two individuals are produced for justice by Russia, and will she be joining and stepping up our diplomatic activity, our countermeasures, our targeted sanctions, so that the whole community, international community, can show their repugnance at what Russia has done in a way that I'm afraid the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, has signally failed to do today.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my right honourable friend, can I thank him for the comments that he made, and obviously he was Foreign Secretary when the attack took place and worked, as I did, with the international community in relation to the response from that international community. I understand, the CPS does not have a policy of requesting extradition from those states whose constitution bars that possibility of extradition. What we are clear about, and that's why we've issued the notices that are available to us in the Interpol Red Notice and the European Arrest Warrant, that, as I said in my statement, if these two individuals step outside Russia, then we will take every step possible to ensure that they are detained and are brought to face justice here in the United Kingdom. And on the other points that my right honourable friend makes, we will indeed be stepping up our activity across the broad range of our capabilities and what is available to us across our national security apparatus to ensure that we are taking every effort to deal with malign state activity and, in particular, as I said in my statement, the activity of the GRU.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We on these benches welcome the Prime Minister's statement and the news that we have now been able to identify the suspects following the Salisbury attack. The attack on Mr. Skripal and his daughter was an unlawful use of force by the Russian state on the streets of Salisbury. We now have the evidence that absolutely, unequivocally confirms that case. And of course, whilst our thoughts are with the Skripals and their recovery, we ought to today remember the sad death of Don Sturgis and Charlie Rowley, who is recovering from the attacks that he suffered from. Mr. Speaker, the news of the arrest warrants today will send a clear message that all of us here will not tolerate the behaviour from the Russians that took place in Salisbury. And whilst I agree with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the actions that are open to us, and that if the two individuals ever leave Russia, that they face the threat of arrest, I think working with our international partners, we really ought to put the maximum pressure on Russia to turn these two individuals over. They must face trial here in the United Kingdom. There must always be a robust response to the use of terror on our streets. Let me reassure